This is a paper that estimates COVID airborne infectivity using carbon dioxide levels, where the major finding is that in a typical outpatient setting, the required indoor carbon dioxide levels at which R naught does not exceed 1. And as a reminder, that R naught is the infectiousness level for COVID, so that's saying that on average you would be infecting just one other person with exposure. This would mean that you would have to keep the indoor carbon dioxide levels at 620 parts per million if people are not masking, 1,000 parts per million if people are using a surgical mask, and 16,000 parts per million with an N95, showing that in substitution of not having good carbon dioxide levels maintained in a building, having a high quality N95 will make up for that deficit. The next important secondary finding was that in a typical inpatient setting, the required indoor carbon dioxide levels need to be below 540 with no mask, 770 with a surgical mask, and 8,200 with an N95 mask. Again, showing the same thing, but having different standards. Before diving in, it's important to note that while this paper is specifically looking at airborne COVID can also be transmitted through contact or droplets. Therefore, while it's outside the scope of this paper, all modes of transmission should be considered when establishing prevention strategies. For the categorized risk of infection using carbon dioxide concentration and the listed actions, if it's below 700 parts per million, that's low risk, no action taken. If it's between 7 and 800, there's a moderate risk, so the door should always be open. If it's between 800 and 1,000 parts per million, that's high risk, and the door should always be open and the windows open for 10 minutes at midday. And if it's above 1,000, that's very high risk, and the door should always be open and windows open for 10 minutes at the end of the teaching hour or in the patient's window or whatever. So why can we use carbon dioxide as a proxy measure for COVID concentration in the air? Well, it's because CO2, carbon dioxide, can reflect breathing and ventilation conditions. If you have a high turnover of air, you're going to have lower carbon dioxide concentrations. And if you have more people in an area, you're going to have higher levels of carbon dioxide concentrations. In this study, they measured the indoor carbon dioxide concentration every 30 seconds for 8 to 180 minutes in the pediatric outpatient rooms, wards, and the respiratory outpatient room at Sasebo Shao Hospital on January 2023. They used the Wells-Riley equation to estimate the probability of airborne transmission of infectious agents indoors, which again considers airborne transmission but neither droplet nor contact transmission. In addition, the model does not consider whether infectious particles are activated or non-activated, meaning the degree of infectiousness of those particles that are aerosolized. So these are things that are just good to know when you're considering the model. Where this graph looks at wearing an N95, a surgical mask, and no mask, the level of carbon dioxide, and then the probability of infection. So for instance, in an outpatient setting at just 600 parts per million of carbon dioxide, if you are not wearing a mask, there's a 30% risk of infection, while if you're wearing an N95, there's less than a 1% chance risk of infection. And if these levels increase to 1,000, which is typically the limit for quote unquote good air, there's about a 75% risk of getting infected with COVID with no mask, while there's still about a 1 to 2% risk of getting infected with an N95. Where this looks at different masking types, strategies, no masking, surgical mask, and N95 mask, and what the permissible levels of carbon dioxide concentration would be in the air. So wearing a mask in a hospital, you'd need a ridiculous level of carbon dioxide, 8,200 parts per million, where that would cause issues for you. While if you wear no mask in a hospital, it would take 540 parts per million, which is basically outside air, just a little higher than outside air where you could get infected, which further demonstrates for us the effectiveness of layered mitigation strategies